and welcome everybody. My name is Evelyn Wolf. I'm the CMO here at VisibleThread, and I am delighted to welcome you all to our Plain Talk webinar today. We're going to be discussing the 2019 Asset Management Report with industry leader Vanguard. We're really delighted to have Shannon Nutter joining us. As I mentioned already, we're having a little technical difficulty to get Shannon's camera integrated with our GoToWebinar. So you might only see Ronan and myself, but you will certainly hear Shannon later on as we get into the fireside chat of this talk. So welcome everybody. I'm excited to have you here. So our agenda today, we're going to do some brief introductions, a little bit of housekeeping before I share with you the key findings of the 2019 Asset Management Report. And then we're going to dive in with our experts, Ronan and Shannon, into our fireside chat. I have a lot of questions for them, and I'm sure so do you. So we have plenty of time at the end for a Q&A as well. So we have about an hour today, and I'm delighted that all of you are joining us. As I mentioned, we have a Q&A session at the end. We're leaving plenty of time. So there's a question facility in your control panel of GoToWebinar. So as questions pop up, just type them into the question facility and we will get to them at the end. When the webinar finishes up, there's a little survey, just 4 questions, and I'd be really grateful if you could give us some feedback on what you thought about the session today. And as always, we will record this webinar and we will share the recording with you afterwards, expected in your inbox early to mid next week. Okay, so without further ado, as I mentioned, my name is Evelyn Wolf. I'm the CMO here at VisibleThread. I was part of the team that completed the Asset Management Report, and I'm really delighted to be the host today. And with that, I'd love to introduce our first expert on the call today, Shannon Nutter from Vanguard. They place second in our report. Shannon, could you introduce yourself to our audience and tell them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Shannon Nutter. I am a principal in Vanguard's Institutional Investor Group. Specifically, I work in our 401k business, and we work to design digital experiences and communications for participants who are seeking to build up retirement savings.
Great, thank you. And our second expert today is Ronan Daly from VisibleThread. Ronan, introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, I shudder at the thought of being called an expert at anything, but that type of label seems to follow me around frequently. I'm lucky to have the role VP of Customer Success here in VisibleThread. Translating that, what that means, I get to spend a lot of time with some of our great customers, understanding their challenges. And I think hence that's why you've invited me onto the call today, Evelyn, to share some of those experiences.
Absolutely, absolutely. You were also part of the research team for the report. So I think between you and I will, absolutely. I think between you and I will be able to give people a lot of color around how the report was generated. And I am really looking forward to the fireside chat because I know you both have great experiences to share. But before I dive into the fireside conversation, I wanted to, especially for those joining us on the call who haven't had a chance yet to look at the Asset Management Report, give a bit of background to what this report was about, why we did it, and some of our key findings. So to give you a bit of an idea, the report itself was into 60 of the largest asset management firms. And what we did at VisibleThread is we looked at the 60 individual websites and we asked 2 questions. The first was, did the firms actually grow trust by communicating more clearly? And the second one was, we ran this report back in 2018. So now looking at the 2019 numbers, what has improved, if anything? So with those 2 questions we set out, looked at the 60 individual websites, ended up looking at over 6,000 individual pages across those sites, and overall 5.8 million words were analyzed to measure clarity. Now we had 5 key findings that I just want to walk you guys through, and we'll talk about, I'll touch on a couple of metrics, here already that I'm sure Ronan and I will dive in later on as well. So I'll give you a brief explanation, and hold tight, we'll dive into that in the fireside chat as well. So our first key finding was, well, looking at clarity of communication and comparing 2018 to 2019, has anything changed? And we look at 4 specific metrics here. We look at readability, which is measured 0 to 100 on a scale called Flesch-Kincaid, 0 being the worst, 100 being the best. And we can see here, not a great improvement from 36 to 37. And this is the average across the site, across all 60 sites. We look at passive voice. Passive voice is a real indicator for academic tone, makes things very, very difficult to engage with and to understand. There was no real change there. On average, passive voice was used 12% of the time, which is actually quite high, and I'll explain that in a minute. Long sentence use, again, was pretty high and very little change. There was a drop from 26 to 25%, but no real impact. And then we also look at complex word use, and there again, we can see, well, very little change from 2.4 to 2.48. Not really a big difference. So that was the first key finding. No change really 2018 to 2019. Diving deeper into readability, we found this, that when we compare the sites and look at their average readability score, we can see where they rank against, some communication pieces, some popular literature that we might be more familiar with. And you can see there on the right, Harry Potter being very easy to read at a 78. Moby Dick comes next. We would always recommend having a reading grade level of 60 or above to make it accessible for everybody. An academic paper on chess comes in there on average at a 40. Next are the asset management firms, unfortunately with a 37. And then comes the average edition of the Harvard Law Review at 30. So you can see, if you're reading about, investments and pensions, you would need nearly, to be at Harvard Law to get an understanding of the websites. So, but again, this is the average of 37. So we can see that there's some firms that have really invested in readability, like Vanguard, and who scored very much higher. And then we have other firms that are not quite seeing yet that readability is a good investment, and that is how that score balances out. Our third key finding then, and I mentioned earlier, passive voice and the overuse of passive voice really gives your content an academic tone. And the problem with it as well is it makes your content less engaging because you don't know who took the action. When somebody says, for example, mistakes were made, we don't know who it is. Actions were taken. Who took the action? It's different to say, we took action, I took action. It makes things more active and immediately more engaging. And what we're looking at here on the right-hand side are unfortunately the worst offenders, so to speak, who really do, we believe, need to look at their passive voice use. And we can see here, we're nearly looking at 8 times the recommended passive voice level in the worst case scenario. So very, very academic tone. And we really advise people to avoid that to make content a lot more engaging. Let me introduce you to key finding 4. And guys, I'm putting my hands up. This is my vice. I tend to write long sentences, and I'm very glad that I get to use VisibleThread every day. That takes me back and says, no, keep your sentences to under 20 words. And the reason for that is quite simply, if you have a very long sentence, like the purple one you can see there on the left, well, by the time you get to the middle or the end, you will have forgotten what the beginning was about. And this is a whopper, and it's an actual sentence taken from one of the websites that has a whopping 70 words to one sentence. The readability of this is 11 out of 100, so a lot worse than even the Harvard Law Review. And on the right-hand side, you can see a little rewrite that we did. And we took the same content, we did that little rewrite, just added 2 additional words, so we're at 72 words now, but split it up into 4 sentences. And now you can see that readability level really having gone up. And you can see a 68 out of 100. And that makes, you know, a big difference for people to be able to understand. Our final key finding then was, let's have a look at complex words. And we recommend a complex word density of 1 or lower. And what do we think are complex words? Well, really what we're looking at are words with 4 syllables. We are looking at, well, some of the examples that I've just put in there on the right. This is taken from plainlanguage.gov. So instead of saying, you know, the remainder of the webinar, say the rest of the webinar. You know, heretofore is a beautiful word, but most of us will be much more comfortable hearing until now. So if you want to dive into this, I do recommend have a look at plainlanguage.gov. There are hundreds of words there where you can look at the complex versus the simple. So the more simple something is, it really helps people to understand your content overall. So this is really what our report found this year. And as I said, I'm really delighted. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a moment so that you can see myself and Ronan, and we'll hear Shannon. So again, for anybody who just joined, we're having small technical issues with one of the cameras, but Shannon is with us. We're going to dive into our fireside chat. And guys, I really want to talk about, first and foremost, about why plain language matters. Shannon, I'd love to start with you. I know Vanguard has a plain language program. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and why it's important to you guys?
Sure, and I'll start just by saying thanks for having me. It's great to be here and to be able to talk about this issue, which I think is a really important one. And I think as you'll hear as we dialogue, right, really core to how Vanguard thinks about communicating with investors. You know, our approach to clear language goes back really more than a decade, and we introduced this idea of plain talk really to cut through the clutter of traditional communications in the financial services industry. We are certainly an industry that has a lot of jargon, a lot of technical terms, and I would say that in the early days, our approach was more philosophical. We had style guides, we had guardrails, we had recommendations for how you might say certain things. And then it was really incumbent on the different editorial teams across our businesses to both apply those things and then maybe come together at certain junctures to say, how can we improve what's working well, what's not working well?
Yeah, I can imagine that must have been quite difficult over, you know, multiple departments to be that kind of guardian of the style.
Yeah, and I mean we serve different audiences, so there's naturally some distinction in perhaps how we talk to people, which is valid. But I would say over the past few years, our approach has really evolved. I think we understand much better now how differently people consume information today than they did years ago, right? No one goes anywhere without a smartphone. They read things on small devices. Attention spans, you know, are purported to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we know so much more today about how people make decisions, about biases we have in our decision making, about brain science. And so trying to take all of that together with language and communicating in a way that really helps people understand investing so that they can make the best decisions for themselves. And investing all alone is intimidating to many folks, and we don't want to sound intimidating. A lot of people lack confidence in this space, and we don't want to add to that by using complex words that make them feel less smart, less educated, less capable of making decisions. So we want to be smart and we want to help them be informed, but also be approachable at the same time.
Yeah, And that is a very, very good point. And I think one of the things you brought up there as well were the smartphones. You know, often we forget, you know, we look down at our phone and we're not ready to consume a lot of complex information via our phone. I'd love to know, Shannon, you know, since you started, have you seen any results yet, or what are you expecting to see?
Well, similar to what you presented actually in some of the findings, we are seeing outcomes such as improved readability. We can measure shorter sentence length. We're certainly using fewer complex words, as you noted. But we have seen different materials shift really from, say, a 12th grade reading level to an 8th grade reading level, things that are just so much easier to understand for the investors who are reading them. And I would say we also measure on the investor side, right? When we ask somebody to take an action, are they more likely to take an action when we are able to write in a way that is more approachable? And we do see that. We also see more frictionless experiences. So if you think about a website, and to the extent that we can be clearer in both what people need to provide or providing reassurance along the way that what they're doing is correct, right? It makes it easier for them to get through a digital process without maybe having to pick up the phone and call somebody, which is not what they wanted to do. They wanted to get through this online.
Exactly. And Ronan, I mean, that's something we talk about a lot, like this effect of, you know, when you make words matter, and we think about what that means to the audience. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you know, what, you know, when we in VisibleThread talk about, you know, words matter and plain language matters, what that actually means?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. But like Evelyn, you're in marketing, right? So you deal with language, I imagine, every day. And if I was to say to you, Evelyn, your communication is full of complex, it's full of jargon, it's got inconsistent tone. You know, I don't think you'd be happy about releasing that type of communication as part of anything that you may be doing, right?
That's right, because I mean,
Yeah.
I think ultimately as marketers, first and foremost, I'm a communicator. So I want to be sure that the message that I have actually arrives with our audience, for sure.
Yeah, so this is the thing when we see when we're doing these analysis, what we're seeing is this type of writing is it's rampant across the sector. All right, so you know, and I don't think you need to be Einstein, you know, to figure out what the consequences of that is. I mean, at a high level, you know, for me and what I see is it's confusion, right? Your customers, the people you are communicating to or trying to, are confused, and that's going to have a knock-on effect. So your products, your services, whatever you're trying to communicate, the message, that's not being effectively explained. And ultimately what that does, it's a knock-on effect. It's going to result in reduced engagement, and over time a loss of trust with your client base. And ultimately, you know, what you're doing is you're missing an opportunity to connect and engage with your customers.
Yeah. And I think, you know, to wrap that thought up, it really impacts the bottom line ultimately. And I think, you know, we've got some great kind of case studies and use cases around how plain language actually positively impacts the bottom line. And Ronan, they're from, you know, some of the customers you work with. Can you share maybe an example?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to share my screen, would I, Evelyn, by any
Hold on.
chance?
You should be able to now.
Okay,
And you
and
absolutely are.
and which screen can you see?
Words matter.
With no camera on it.
The camera is on top, so now we can see your use case.
Okay, all right. So I am going to, I need to be able to share a different screen. And let's try this one. Okay, well, let me do this.
Perfect.
Slideshow. I'll put this over here, and I'll put this over here. Now, is that better?
Yes, so we can see your slide, the slide outline.
Yeah, perfect. So
There we
what
go.
I'm going to keep it just like that because I've got issues with screens here. Right, I got two quick case studies because and these are real life scenarios, and it's worth the visual aid because what we do when we're analyzing the communications is we're applying metrics based on best practice communications on those. So here's one from a call center perspective, and the organization in question were sending out letters to their customers, explanation, clarification letters, and they were noticing an unusual spike in volume associated with those letters. So we did some analysis, obviously with VisibleThread in this particular case, and we were, the insight derived from those showed that letter was confusing among a number of different areas, from long sentences, passive voice, readability, complex words, grade level. The whole lot wasn't really kind of squared with explaining something simply. So what we did is we rewrote the letter. We used our software, obviously, to do it in this particular case study. And you can see the second piece there. We've got the green lights, good to go. And what we did is we measured the impact that had on the call center. So that was, and this is just in 1 month, by the way, okay? This wasn't over a period of a year or
Wow.
anything. We saw a 19% reduction to the help desk associated with this letter. We saw 23% reduction in related resubmissions, so erroneous submissions, and a conservative estimate. I've actually seen higher, but a conservative estimate of $325,000 annualized savings as a result of the efficiencies with the plain language letter. So again, that's a great example of where writing in plain language has both a benefit for the end customer who can understand it better, and then also benefit for the organization's bottom line. And another one that we have, and this is a retail banking example, and it's a kind of a customer journey. So often you'll have journeys you want to bring your customers through. Typically, they're engaging in these on a mobile device, and what we see is sometimes when we measure the language used on every stage of those customer journeys, that surprise, we might have some bottlenecks. So you can see there on our little graph that we've got green is good, and then all of a sudden we run into a whole load of red stuff where we've got high grade levels, high level of complex language used, and that often serves as a bottleneck. And we can see that when we put Google Analytics beside the pages. So when we align the language with the Google Analytics, so many times we kind of see a drop off or an increase in bounce rate or a decrease in the time on page because people are they're butt off, they can't comprehend it, and then they click away. And in this particular case, we took that customer journey, we improved the language across all the steps, and we saw, like, we improved it dramatically, 7 grades improvement in that language. And we observed improved time on page. We saw fewer bounce rates, and more importantly, we saw more completions of that particular customer journey. So I think another great example, get the language right, and I think good things can happen, to your processes.
Absolutely. And there's some very specific metrics that we look at and that you just alluded to, and Shannon already mentioned grade level as well. So I think it's interesting probably for people to know that we do look at the different elements that I mentioned at the beginning. So readability being one, long sentence use, passive voice, but also the actual grade level. And we would always say, write at a grade level of 8 or lower to make sure that, the average person can understand. And those are the metrics that we would use. Shannon, can I ask you, in Vanguard, what are some of the metrics outside of grade level that you would use? What do you place importance on?
Yeah, I would say that it's pretty consistent. Certainly looking at readability and saying, hey, can we get that at least to a 50, but certainly aim to be higher than that. Can we use passive voice as little as possible, ideally less than 5% of the time? And can we focus on getting rid of jargon, complex words? That can be difficult in an industry like financial services, but again, to your point of how can you say this most simply in the most accessible words that you can find, right, to ensure that anyone could understand what you're talking about, not somebody who simply works in this industry or who is, knowledgeable in it.
Have you a way to test that? I'd be really interested to know. Do you test it internally, or do you take it out to customers and say, can you, this new piece of communication, how easy is it to understand? How do you make sure that you're on the right path?
Yeah, so we do a variety of testing. We do a lot of experimentation in-house, so we can put different versions of language, say, out on the web, and can literally assess real time. Are we getting people to take action more? And in our case, often taking action is saving more money, so actually improving their retirement. It's not just return for Vanguard, right? It's you're making someone's life better, their future better. So it has real meaning in terms of, can you improve language and get people to understand quickly what you need them to do? But in addition to the real-time experimentation, we've also gone out to, in our case, people in retirement plans, and shared with them different versions of language to get them to literally assess, which one do you prefer? And we see preference for the more simple, higher readability, lower grade level language, 7-to-1.
Wow.
Yep.
That's huge. I mean, I shouldn't be as surprised, but it is, for me, it's always, it's so interesting to hear that what we believe in here in VisibleThread is actually what, big organizations like yourself in businesses that might be seen as traditionally complex, where your audience, your customers, the people you serve are actually saying, hold on, simplicity is actually what we're looking for. So 7-to-1, wow.
Yeah, and I would say one other thing is we used to have communications that I don't know, right? It was everything in the kitchen sink, everything you might need to know about this particular issue, and boy, we better educate you. And I'm putting that in quotes. You can't see my fingers. About this particular topic. And now I think the perspective is different. Is what is the one thing I really need you to get out of this communication? And can you get that point in less than 6 seconds? And
Wow.
if you can't, right, we probably haven't done our job in terms of making it abundantly clear what it is we need you to pay attention to and focus on in this particular communication.
That's a great way of measuring and figuring out if you're going down the right track. And it's honestly, it's fantastic to hear that level of implementation, because what we hear a lot, and I'm sure, Shannon, I'll ask you about this in a minute, but I want to throw this over to Ronan. We hear this a lot, and we've seen this in the report. There's some really big names that we didn't expect to be actually, trailing behind. And we know there are challenges around managing clarity. So what are the kind of the pushbacks and the challenges sometimes, Ronan, that you come across when you're out there and you're talking to different organizations?
The pushbacks.
So yeah. Or why would you think that some of the larger organizations are trailing behind?
Well, I think firstly, without using any kind of enterprise-ready artificial intelligence or NLP techniques, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Okay, so it's simple enough. Without the insight or without the visibility, what you don't see, you don't know. So out of sight, out of mind. And look, this can be kind of, I guess, compounded by organizational complexity. I think we're all familiar with the typical large structure that we live in today with organizations, this matrixed type organization, which has got multiple business units, from HR to operations to legal to bid proposals to sales. And they're all, in a sense, siloed within, even though they're one organization, they're all working kind of often independently. And standardizing your language across all of these touch points, and they are all multiple touch points to your customers, it's impossible unless you're using modern enterprise-ready AI techniques to help.
Yeah. Shannon, when you kicked off the Plain Language program, was there Was there any internal kind of pushback or concerns?
Well, I don't know that there's been anybody who said, gee, no, we shouldn't communicate clearly to our investors, right? I think the notion of what is clear is where there's been differing opinions, right, over time. And I think generally as an industry, and probably we're still seeing it in the numbers you have today, there are a lot of folks, I'm sure all of those folks at all of these companies, right, at all of our companies, no one thinks they're writing in a way that isn't understandable, right? Nobody's coming into work and saying, let me make something really unclear, right?
True.
They're trying. It's just how can you push that bar even further? And I think that probably there's been some finger pointing, I'll say, over the years, broadly speaking, that folks might blame legal and compliance or other groups of, well, we would write differently, but these groups, you know, really tell us that we have to write in this particular way. And I would say that, you know, we certainly haven't found that, and I would push back against that as a belief system. In our experience, we've found that when we partner with these teams within Vanguard and say, hey, we have a shared goal. You know, our shared goal as an organization is to give investors the best chance of investment success. And doing that means they have to understand what we're asking them to do and what they're investing in. And I think as we go into those sorts of partnerships, we really sit down at a table and appreciate the fact that we all are bringing a different kind of expertise to the table. Legal knows what has to be said. They know what the risks are. Now, I would argue that our editorial teams know how best to say it. They know how to express why these risks matter. And so really it's complementary, and that when we can work together as partners, we've found these groups to be highly supportive. One, they appreciate the fact that we value their expertise. They appreciate the partnership. And as we're working through different efforts to, you know, in some cases radically change the way we're communicating, we've had nothing but great support from legal and compliance.
That's fantastic. And that must have made the rollout, because I mean, you're not a small organization. So this must have made the rollout and actually doing plain language at scale a lot easier then.
Yes, and I would say it's been very empowering for the editorial teams as well, when they can submit something to legal and it literally comes back with no material edits, because legal reads it and says, yep, you've communicated exactly what you need to communicate, but boy, you've done it in a really approachable way, right? Nobody in legal wants to make it more complicated.
Exactly. And it's great when you can see, you know, when you get that great compliment back from legal to say, actually, you're right. And this is done in a way that is so understandable, because it is quite impactful on the customer experience. The use case of the buyer's journey that Ronan showed there earlier, it actually starts dropping once it hits the terms of service. So once you hit the legal part, it starts going red. And I think it's simply an example from, and this one was from a retail bank that simply hadn't caught up yet to the fact that working in silos isn't going to work. And we might have teams that have great subject matter experts, but they just need a little bit of help in terms of how do you take that expertise and turn it into something that delivers still a great customer experience and great clarity to the people who are actually going to read it.
Yep.
I'd love to talk to you, Shannon, a little bit about kind of customer experience, because I have to admit I was going through your bio, and I was doing a little bit of LinkedIn stalking, as one does with these things. And you were the voice of the client for US and international business at Vanguard before you took your current role. And I love the idea of somebody being the voice. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be, you know, the voice of the client?
Sure. So when I joined Vanguard, I led our market research and voice of client teams. And the role of that organization really was to represent the voice of the investor. So to ensure that as we were getting feedback from our end clients across all of our businesses around the world, was to, we had folks who took that information, synthesized it, created insight out of it. And then it's really our job to make sure that people across the company knew what was working well and what wasn't working well. Really, where are investors frustrated? Where are they confused? And all with the intent, obviously, of trying to make the experience better.
Fantastic. It's a high responsibility to actually be able, and a very privileged position, I suppose, to be able to listen to investor concerns and feedback at that level, and then seeing how the change actually impacts them directly.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Ronan, I suppose one of the things that does come up for us quite a bit is kind of this pushback, I suppose, from potentially organizations that might not yet have found their voice of the client, to say, hey, you know what, complex products require complex language. And that is actually a piece of feedback that we did receive in response to our report. And I'd love to talk to you, Ronan, a little bit about the sophisticated customer. Can you tell us what kind of this idea of the sophisticated customer is and how that might be a bit of a fallacy?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, I think it is important to understand your audience, okay, and who you're writing for. And I don't think it's one case necessarily fits all, okay? I think sometimes there are scenarios where you can have nuances or different language or different words, that you use communicating from one audience, let's say, versus another. Okay, but and I don't really have an opinion on this myself. Well, I do, but opinions are, what are they worth? Not a lot. But what I can tell you is the research shows us, something key. And Evelyn, I don't know if you've seen this research, but who do you think are the individuals who appreciate plain language the most? Not by my opinion or by research. I don't know if you've seen that one.
I haven't, no.
Well, I can tell you it is this sophisticated customer that we're talking of. They are shown to be the individuals who just love getting their communication in a kind of a plain language, easy to read format. And the reason behind this is it's simple enough, is that they're the individual, or the type of individual, that gets bombarded with the most communication within an organization. They're the ones that have to deal with tons and tons of data on a day-to-day basis. So when they get communications that are clear, simple, and easy to track through, and again, it's not me saying it, it's the research shows, that is what they prefer to receive time and again.
Now, and I have to say, I agree. And I'm not going to call myself sophisticated now by any stretch of the imagination.
Me neither.
But this idea of, because we're most likely going to sell to people who have a college or university degree, we can use more complex language. I think you're absolutely right, because we get hit with so much communication, whether by post or by email, on websites, etc. There's so much out there. And often we consume content on a very, very small screen. And we don't have much time either. So having the burden of understanding words that are, 4 syllables plus, that could be, somebody recently said to me, you know what, there's a much better way than saying adhere to. And I was thinking, and I couldn't think of the alternative. And she just said to me, stick to. I'm like, yes, that makes so much more sense. and and it makes things, in that moment you go, oh yeah, okay, I know exactly what you mean. And in a busy day, I think you help any audience, whether you think your audience is sophisticated or not, to really get your point across.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I just think we're all so strapped for time, and I can speak for myself in that you open an email, and if it looks long and convoluted, I mean, you don't even have to get stymied by language. You could get stymied by length, and you just think, ugh, can't deal with it right now. Close it back up, right? Versus you get a communication that is a quick little executive summary. You can tell it's been summarized. Maybe they've put the one key thing you need to actually do right at the top, and you think, oh, okay, that's all I need to do. I've got my little information done.
Yeah, it makes such a big difference. The other thing I'd like to ask you both, maybe Shannon, I'll ask you first. Do you think it makes a difference? Because this is another kind of piece of feedback that we get, and like, oh yeah, plain language, really important if you're dealing B2C. But if you're B2B, you can be a lot more complex. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I would disagree. I mean, I feel like Ronan's right in that, right, there are times when obviously you might deal with a more complex topic. You might be able to dive into slightly more nuanced ideas, but I think there's a real difference between being simple and clear and being simplistic, right? We never want to talk down to anybody, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with making something easy to understand.
Yeah.
And I would argue that it's a sign both of great writing and great understanding of your concept or your topic if you could explain it to anyone. To me, that's really when you know somebody knows their stuff. If they can take something that is utterly complex. I mean, I think of Stephen Hawking as a great example of this, right? One of the world's greatest thinkers about the universe and physics, and yet could talk to an audience of regular people about the ideas that he studied, and people could understand them.
Yeah. I think Einstein actually had a great quote as well, and it's not coming to me, and please don't quote me on the fact that it is Einstein. Do you know what, guys? For anybody listening, if you know what it is, just pop it into the question. It will really, in the question box, because it will really help me. Otherwise, I will Google this after our call, and I will share it. But this idea that, hey, if you can't explain what you want to say in simplistic terms, you probably haven't understood it yourself. That's kind of, now that's not the exact wording, but that's the meaning of it. And I think there's real merit and value in that, in saying, right, if I speak too complex, well, maybe I'm masking that I'm not the expert in this area. I'm not the person you should be actually listening to. And that actually often has an impact, I would think, on customer trust. And Ronan, again, this is something that, you know, VisibleThread, we speak a lot about, and we spoke a lot about in the report as well, about, you know, trust hasn't improved, and we link trust to clear communications. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that link of trust and communication, and how plain language influences trust?
Yeah, look, it's not like we are experts in trust on this side. I mean, our expertise is on language, right? But when we look to others, I mean, this is the thing is, for example, where we get most of our, let's say, industry information on trust would be from organizations like the Edelman Trust Barometer. Now, if you've never heard of that, just type it into Google. Edelman, they conduct research globally on trust across multiple industries. Now, it's in the report, but if you haven't seen it or if you haven't heard, they rate the financial services industry has bottom when it comes to trust, and that's been consistent. Okay, there was a little improvement in 2019, but not a lot. So 2018, 2019, trust in that sector has been very low. Now, there's a number of different factors, you know, associated with that. I'm not saying it's all about language, but Edelman themselves, in terms of the research that they've completed, they identified that one element is linked to language and the ability to clearly communicate with your customers. So we're seeing on Edelman's side very little movement in trust from their research, and then likewise, you know, on our side we see very little movement in the improvement of communications. So for us, you know, the correlation is clear. There has been no increase in quality communications from our aspect. So, and that kind of goes in line with what Edelman is seeing on their side. You know, trust is still very poor in this particular sector.
And Shannon, I suppose, you know, from a practical perspective, when you sit down with your team and you think about, you know, building strategy, does trust come up as a player in that strategy?
I don't know that we talk about trust explicitly as in, gee, how are we going to convince people to trust us? Where I think it does come up, and maybe this sounds really philosophical for a financial services firm, but you think about trust building coming really from honesty, in terms of you need to believe what you hear and feel that somebody is being honest with you. I think clear language can help with that. If all of a sudden you're getting this complex, complicated language that you don't understand, I think there can be a natural inclination to say, wait, somebody's trying to confuse me. Maybe somebody's trying to pull a fast one on me, right? And you don't want that. And then obviously experiencing the experience that a customer has as actually being a reflection of what you've been told. So they told me this was going to happen. That's actually what happened. I think trust comes from both of those things. And, you know, we need to do that day in and day out, really understand who our investors are, understand their lives, speak to them clearly and honestly, and then do our best to make sure that our experience backs that up.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great way of putting it. Now, to everyone who's listening, I promised you Q&A, so I'm going to dive over into our questions, and we've got quite a few. Now, the first question is actually for Ronan. In the first use case that you shared, can you break down what items you saved on in the 325,000 annual savings?
Now, let me think from my memory. That particular figure. So first of all, I mean, it's a good question, right? And I guess the high level principle there is that once you can start to measure the language and be able to put metrics on these plain language principles, you can literally tie it into any measurement in your organization, whether that's Google Analytics, call center efficiency. You have quantification that you can tie to any type of A/B testing that you're already doing. So in this particular case, in this scenario, we tied it to efficiencies gained by the individuals who are dealing with the calls. Okay, so that would have been time on a call, time sorting out the individuals who had erroneously resubmitted those particular documents. And then once we were able to see, we don't need to spend time on these anymore because we don't have as many calls, we don't have any resubmissions. Well, then you're able to make the calculation directly linked to that efficiency based on time. So in that scenario, that's how they came up with those calculations.
I think with that particular use case, there was quite a significant drop in call center volume. Was it 19%? Was that kind of what I had in mind?
For the period of the trial that we were testing it, we saw 19%. And again, that was just over a month.
So again, that will help you do that calculation. We got quite a few questions on the sources. So for the use cases, guys, the sources actually come from that Ronan used. The use cases are all results that VisibleThread has seen with customers that we're running. Is the data published anywhere? Our report is here, and I will share the link to it so you can download it, so you will see exactly where the data in particular from the key findings came from. And let me just go through. We've got plenty of more. Here's a question for Shannon. Do you have any concrete examples of how Plain Talk has helped Vanguard save money, increase retention, or attract new customers?
Yeah, I would say essentially on all of those fronts. Similar to the case studies Ronan shared, we look at things like the effectiveness of web pages. We'll often refer to it as the health of a web page. So if language on a page is potentially causing people to call the call center. So they're starting digital, they'd like to finish digital, but for whatever reason, something is tripping them up. The page is technically working correctly, right? So it isn't something that would get flagged by your IT team as saying, right, this page is not functioning. But when you look at the metrics, you can see that a whole host of folks are sort of abandoning the web and having to go to the phone, which again, isn't their ideal choice. And so then as we experiment with language on some of those pages and potentially do research as well with participants in our case to understand what the challenges are, it could be everything from, gee, I just don't know what some of these terms are. It could be things like, well, I'm not sure I'm doing it correctly. So then the question for our editorial teams becomes, how can you provide a level of reassurance within the context of a digital experience that somebody's doing something correctly? So we can track changes and then link that to call centers. We certainly look at outcomes being driven by various communications. So if a communication, whether it is email or on the website, is asking someone to do a particular task, maybe it's save more and here's why, you know, how many people are taking action? And through the use of both language and behavioral finance, how can we get people to take actions more often that benefit them in the future? So we try to tie as much as we can in terms of our language and our ability to measure the effectiveness of what we're doing, so that it isn't, you know, simply this gut feel, which I think is what language used to be years ago, right? It was, you know, who is the loudest voice, who feels they have the best sense of language and whether they deem it good or bad. And now we've got a lot of metrics that really can show, not just in the, you know, readability, et cetera, but are customers taking the action we want them to take? And how can we improve those numbers through language?
Yeah, and I believe actually I read, I think as well, that you guys do a fair amount of A/B testing around this as well, in particular on the site. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of how that process works? I'd love to give people a couple of kind of tips that they can take away and potentially try on their own sites.
Well, I mean, it's essentially, we might take the control of whatever's being done today and then revise that, whether it's revising language in the ways we've already talked about, making it more readable. It could be turning some language into visuals. It could be leveraging different behavioral science techniques or decision-making biases that we know people have. And so how do you frame your language within the context of you know, these different ways we know that people either anchor to numbers or how they think of themselves today versus in the future. So can you write sort of with some of those things in mind and then literally measure the results? And then if we see an improvement, right, a significant improvement, we will then make that the new control. And then the teams will, right, just continue to make incremental improvements.
Fantastic. And I think that's an important piece in this as well, that, you know, there are these incremental improvements all the time. So it's a journey, and a journey that needs to, I suppose, start somewhere. And a question that is here, and a question that we get asked quite a lot is, hey, so all sounds great. Where do we start? Ronan, how do you answer that question when we get it? Where do you kick off a plain language program?
Oh, well, look, I mean, I think, first of all, you're asking the question, where do we start? That's the first step. I mean, the next thing I think you have to ask yourself is like, what is readability? All right, well, you know, and I think when you think about that yourself, you start to kind of come up with all of these ideas. Our communication has to be clear, simple, conversational. There has to be tone in it. There has to be clarity. And the one thing you're going to see is that readability isn't just one thing, right? It's a whole range of different types of elements, all right, which is what makes this so tricky. And I think then, you know, putting on my VisibleThread hat, of course, you know, once you're kind of, all right, I understand that I need to be able to get a grip on this. I understand that it's made up of multiple areas. Well, then, you know, you've got to start kind of testing it, creating a benchmark. One of the things that most 95% of our customers do is they do a test. They do what we call a proof of value. They focus on a specific area, whether it's a customer journey, a call center issue, or customer communication, you know, and when we say a proof of value, what we're talking about is this A/B type of testing. You know, let's do a benchmark. Let's see where we are with that. If we've got any kind of customer analytics associated with it, let's freeze it in with that benchmark. Then let's rewrite it. Let's adhere to the plain language principles. You know, all of those metrics, all they're doing is guiding you towards those plain language principles, which, guess what, Evelyn? They've been around for years. There's nothing new in this. It's just that now we have this modern technology to be able to quickly look at it, analyze it, and put metrics on it. Rewrite it, and then let it fly, you know, back out to the customers and remeasure it again and see what the impact is. You can do this. This type of test can be done, you know, over a 3-month time period, depending on what you're doing, 3 to 6 months, and prove the value for yourself. And I think once you start on that type of journey, I would be very confident that, you know, the value will be something that will surprise you and be substantial. And I think there you're taking the first step forward to this kind of plain language communication with your customers into the future.
I was going to ask you both about, you know, what's your top tip? And I think, Ronan, you know, what you were saying, that first step and actually deciding what is that one thing to focus in on, to see and to do that proof of value, proof of concept, to say this works. I think that's a really great top tip. Shannon, would you have like a top tip for our audience, for the people listening, on, you know, where to start with plain language, how to show value early on?
Yeah, I would echo the start small. You know, I suspect that every team, marketing team, editorial team, has a list of things they hate in their department that they think are terrible. And because that's how it's always been done, that's how it's still being done. And, you know, sometimes those are good places to start, because if folks can really make a change in those, and it could be taking a 10-page letter and turning it into a 2-page letter, you know, a 15-page kit that you send out to customers that seems unclear, and you somehow turn it into a 2-page document, right? When folks can start to see, wow, one, I'm empowered to make some of these changes, and then, like Ronan said, put it out in the field, start to get some reactions. And I think particularly when teams get to start with something that really they're passionate about and they haven't liked for a long time and they would love to see it changed, right? You can drive a lot of energy and enthusiasm within your teams that then, right, when you do get those small wins, which you will, right, it just starts to snowball, and then you just sort of incrementally improve. You can't tackle it all at once, right? It's just, there's too much in generally every organization. So just, you know, start somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point. Start somewhere, start small, prove concept, and then take it further. We've just come to the top of the hour. A lot of the other questions we had were actually around, you know, where do your statistics come from? Share the sources. I want to give a shout out to Steve, who actually shared where the quote came from. So I'm going to have a look in a minute. But what I will say to you, you can see it on the screen there. There's a link to our homepage. To visit our homepage, you can download the report from there. In the back of the report is a whole section around the methodology that shows you exactly where we get our stats from here in VisibleThread. If you want to learn a little bit more about how we actually did it, how we pulled the report, how we get those statistics, have a look at the VT Insights platform, also on our site. And ultimately, if you're interested to learn more, you can ask us, send us an email for a demo request, or if you have any additional questions to today's webinar, feel free to reach out to me directly. We've come to the top of the hour. I want to thank our audience for joining us today, and I want to say a very, very special thank you to Ronan and to Shannon for sharing their experiences and their tips with everybody today. This was a real treat, so thank you both very, very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn.
Have a lovely day, everybody, and we hope to see you during our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye.